Hi, a warm welcome to today's discussion forum on feminist for women for the planet. Basically, we are talking about the climate change and the role of women in the meeting the climate change challenges. So, in that context, we have a very powerful panel today. We have Dr. Asha DeVos, founder, executive director, Oceans Well, and Ms. Vishaka Tilagaratna, consultant, food security and community development, and an activist. I will introduce them formally later. A warm welcome again to everyone today. This discussion is part of the series of conversations hosted by UN Women and the French Embassy in Sri Lanka on gender equity in anticipation of the Generation Equality Forum being hosted in Paris next week. This conversation is linked also to the forum's theme of Feminists for Climate Justice. Our conversation today will specifically focus on the gendered impact of climate change and related disasters in Sri Lanka. Why it is necessary of women being meaningfully involved in leading interventions against climate change challenges. It could be a mitigation of climate change or adjusting to the climate change, what we call as adaptation. The limited research in Sri Lanka reflect we are also going along with the global patterns of women being disproportionately affected while lacking the capacity and empowerment to adapt and lead these climate mitigation situations and adaptation situations. All of these got worsened due to COVID-19 context. Everybody is now talking about climate. Now the latest one is climate linked with biodiversity and the natural and man-made disasters we are experiencing every other day. Now we are seeing floods on one hand, ships on the other hand. So this conversation is very relevant to our times. Women have a specific role, what the disaster may be. It could be a man-made one or a natural one. Now there's nothing called natural anymore because all of them are accelerated or worsened by the man. So let me take this opportunity to share a few guiding points so that we can get the best out of this planned, very tight discussion. Each speaker will have approximately about 15 to 20 minutes to speak. And then the questions will be handled the standard manner in Zoom, the question and answer feature. And also you can raise the hand and directly ask the questions, so depending on the time availability. And so we will continue to flow the discussion as much as possible. So with that, let me first introduce our first speaker for the day, Dr. Asha DeVos, founder, executive director, Oceans Well. Dr. DeVos is an internationally acclaimed Sri Lankan marine biologist, an ocean educator, and a pioneer of long-term blue whale research within the North Indian Ocean. She is also an adjunct research fellow at the Ocean Institute of University of Western Australia. Asha has degrees from University of St. Andrews, University of Oxford, and University of Western Australia. Now Asha now leads her own not-for-profit Oceans Well, Sri Lanka's first marine conservation research and education organization. We see her in all different places. She's been thoroughly recognized both locally and internationally. Without further ado, I would welcome Asha to go through the presentation. Thank you. Asha, floor is yours.
Okay, so when I was asked to talk at this event, I mean, it's a real pleasure to be here because it's a topic that I think is very important. Thinking about a lot of these topics in a gendered manner is important because the way things impact us, different groups of people varies. And I was sent a couple of questions to think through. that I'm going to try to answer through my conversation with you today. So first of all, just as an introduction, so what is climate change? Let's think about it for a second, right? It's basically a change in the usual weather pattern found in a place. So it's not, it could be a change in how much rain a place gets over a certain time. So it's a longer term change, not like a change that happens from day to day. And we know from some research that's been done in Sri Lanka, we definitely are seeing the impacts of climate change here. We are seeing increased air temperatures over a longer period of time, continuously increasing. So what are the impacts of that when we think about it? If you think about it in the marine context, we know that we are experiencing more extreme weather events, things like heat waves on land, but also large storms. They're going to be much more frequent, increased intensity of these things. And if we think about marine heat waves particularly, they're basically prolonged periods when temperatures are unusually high, right? So it's not when you have an increase in ocean temperature for a few days, but we're talking about a longer period of time. And the thing is, when you have these marine heat waves, if they, if they happen and then things cool down again, it's not impossible for us to come back from that situation. But when you have marine heat waves back to back, obviously, there's no time for the system to recover. That becomes a problem. And then what comes as a result of that? Well, coral bleaching is one of those things that you may have heard of. The coral, basically, it overheats. And as a result, we can have the corals all turning white. This can also reverse, but again, it's what are the other pressures on it? So it's climate change doesn't work in isolation. That's another thing we have to think about, right? It works as part of a system of threats that come together to put pressure on this entire ecosystem. We see a reduction in phytoplankton, which is the base of every marine food web. That's the tiny microscopic plants that we see at the surface of our oceans that are incredibly important. We have a reduction in phytoplankton in our oceans, particularly in the northern Indian Ocean. It has reduced by, about 30% in the last 60 years. That is significant because there's less things at the base of food web, less plants, which means we have less everything else in the food web as well. That can then have obviously an impact in terms of fish stocks in our oceans. And when you have fish stocks reducing, then you can have obviously a risk to food security and people's livelihoods. We have acidification, right? So we have this, the ocean's been absorbing all this excess carbon dioxide that we've been pumping out. And that's because the ocean is a carbon sink. It has a capacity to absorb a certain amount. Up to now, 25% of the carbon emissions we've created are excess carbon emissions have been held into the ocean. That means we have carbon dioxide mixing with water, which means we have ocean acidification. Well, how does that impact livelihoods? Well, when you have ocean acidification, species like shrimp that have their skeletons on the outside, the exoskeleton, that can dissolve as a result of it. So if we can't have shrimp, then there are communities that obviously depend on being able to catch this shrimp for sale, for that survival, right? And food sources will deplete for the species in our oceans, which means we'll see species shifting their ranges. They'll move to different places because they're not comfortable. There's no food. The temperatures are intolerable. So we're going to see a lot of changes because of climate change, right? And that's something we have to think about. But when we think about climate change, then we have to think about it through a gendered lens. I don't know if we have much of a choice, but we've always talked about these issues as the threat of climate change on livelihoods, right? But that's an inappropriate way of looking at it because how it impacts men and how it impacts women really differs, right? And it is a lot more complex than we like to think it is. So when you think about feminism, we know that it's a movement that's set on achieving gender equality, right? But now we've moved away from that concept, moved towards a new term, which is intersectional feminism. It's not that new, but it was coined to really be more representative and inclusive of all the voices of people who have faced different kinds of discrimination, sometimes benefits, different identities experience these problems in different ways. And sometimes you have compounded problems. Some communities are impacted by COVID-19 right now worse than others, but then you add to that the layer of climate change, and that can exacerbate the problems in these different communities in very different ways. So adding the idea of intersectionality to feminism means that we're being truly inclusive, and it allows all women of all races, economic standings, religions, identities, and orientations to have their voices heard. And up to now, when we thought about feminism, it's been big, and we're moving away, because when we thought about feminism, we were really representing the white middle class woman. That was what, like, your gender, your female was. And so the representation of issues was very centered on that one community. But we know that there are certain minorities, marginalized communities, that will be impacted more by issues, right? So, and we know increasing evidence shows that women are more vulnerable to to climate change. There are about figures show that about 80% of people displaced by climate change are women. And they have roles of being primary caregivers, providers of food, and that makes them very vulnerable when you have these flooding and drought events, right? These constant flooding and drought. They might be subsistence farming, they might be gleaning. So in some situations, you'll have women in fisheries who will be collecting food or fisheries for their families and just the local community. When you have these intense events, then that can reduce their opportunity to go out there, but they're also balancing that provision with child and home care duties. And so oftentimes what happens is these marginalized people are either excluded from accessing ocean resources, or they're relegated to more denuded and polluted places. And they tend to bear the greatest brunt of climate change, but often have the least hand in causing it. So if we think about all of this in the context of COVID-19, the situation we are in right now, well, we don't have direct evidence to say that climate change is influencing the spread of COVID-19, but we do know that climate change alters how we relate to other species on Earth. And that matters to our health and our risk of infections, right? So when we think about it, as the planet heats up, species start to move, right? So you'll have species that typically lived in the tropics will start to move into the more polar regions because the temperatures are more comfortable for them. As they move into those areas, they start to come into contact with species that they've never encountered before. That means you can have pathogens getting into new hosts. If you think about the root cause of climate change, like deforestation, they increase the risk of pandemics too. When you have deforestation, and that happens largely for, say, agricultural purposes. And when we destroy those habitats, new species come face to face with often densely populated communities. Again, this opportunity for germs to be shared. So we need to think about climate change as a way, and we need to take climate action if we want to actually prevent that next pandemic from happening, right? So preventing deforestation, which is, like I said, a root cause of climate change, can help stem biodiversity loss, as well as slow down animal migrations that can increase this risk of infectious disease spread. Reducing air pollution, like by burning fossil fuels, for example, coal, oil, and natural gas, as we know, that adds to climate change, and that can keep people's lungs healthy, which again can save, having better, healthier lungs can help in situations like COVID-19. And we shouldn't be separating health and environmental policy at this time. It's really important for us to consider them as two parts of the whole, because our health depends on the climate and the other organisms that we share our planet with. So we need to view the environmental life on Earth as one and not as separate entities. So if we talk about why we don't see more women at the decision-making levels, there's lots of problems with this. And I'm going to talk from my own personal experience as someone who is a scientist who kind of talks about these kinds of issues. There's a lot of things working against us. One thing is for sure in Sri Lanka, certainly the kind of job I do as a marine biologist, a lot of people, first of all, were surprised that anyone would want to be a marine biologist when I was in my earliest days of my career, because they couldn't understand what anyone would do as a marine biologist in this very beautiful tropical island. But then the second layer is that, when you go into meetings, often people, and in my early days, I would be ignored for being too young and too female. But I was the only person with that expertise. But it's also this sense that, oh, this is a man's job. Why are you doing it and why are you speaking on it, right? So we come with these preconceived notions of who has a right to speak, and but judging on gender and those kinds of things, rather than actually judging people on what they're able to do and their capacities. And so for me, that's been sort of the struggle. And it's, the piece of advice I give all young women trying to come into certain fields, particularly like mine. I always say, look, it's very unfortunate. We live in a world where women have to work a lot harder than men, but work so hard that you become a necessity, right? So that at some point, people will call you into a room because they need you, because that problem cannot be solved without your presence. And that's sort of where we need to all strive to be at the moment, right? And I'm not saying it's ideal, but I'm saying that's how we're going to have to go. But don't forget to use your gender to empower others, because your strength, you can be an inspiration to others who see themselves in you. And that's important for us to also remember. So we need to think about how do we make sure that all genders are at the table. There are so many different perspectives that are broad. Men and women experience things differently. We need all those viewpoints. I mean, how can we protect a planet for 100% of the population if only 50% of the people are making the decisions and having these conversations, right? And that's, I think, a key thing. And just to close, if we talk about the COVID-19 situation once again, and we think about, okay, is there hope, right? Like when we look at the satellite images, we see that there's been a decrease in air pollution in certain COVID hotspots. Now, that's good news, obviously, but during the global financial crisis of 2008, we saw a similar trend where there was a decrease in air pollution across the world. But what happened was, as soon as that kind of a couple of years after the financial crisis, we saw a wild increase in air pollution, right? So people went back to business as usual in almost more like wild way, right? Like everyone was clearly, there was more air pollution, which says something about how we reacted to the situation. And so as we're thinking about recovery from, say, COVID-19, we do need to think about climate action as part of the steps we take to move forward, to kind of benefit from any slight positives that we may have experienced, at least on behalf of the environment during this period. And lastly, if I was to think about the changes that I've seen at government, community, individual levels, like what could give me hope? And that was sort of one of the last question I was asked. And are women being increasingly supported in these spaces and given leadership? So I'm going to say that, yes, okay, if you think about it globally, there are definitely more women coming into the conversation. That's an awesome thing. I think that's really great. I hope all these women are finding themselves at the right table and allowed to project their voices. I'll give you an example. If we think about how women are perceived in the scientific space, certainly if we're talking about this particular incident that we're going through right now, the MV Express Pearl, I'm a scientist, so I look for conclusive evidence before I can make statements. But we live in this world now where people want fast answers, right? They want fast answers. And so as a result, if I'm very honest about the fact that I don't know the answer because I don't have evidence, so I can't just make a statement, I can't speculate. I've been attacked on social media by trolls. I was attacked by people who didn't believe that there were other threats in the ocean that could potentially impact the species that we're seeing washing up on our beaches, for example. And this goes to show that one thing is that there is this weird relationship with science, and I think, and so climate change is, it's a component of that. It's this great unknown that people don't feel in their daily lives, and as a result don't pay attention to it. So their reaction is that it doesn't exist until it hits you in the face, and that's what we're seeing in this situation, which is very unfortunate. We shouldn't be faced with disaster to actually wake up and start to try to make change. And I think one way to resolve that is to actually start looking into our school syllabuses. We've been doing a project on looking at sort of how the oceans and marine space is represented in local textbooks. And really, we have zero marine literacy, right? So if suddenly at 18, people are encountered with the term climate change, their reaction to it is going to be very different to something that you're growing up with as a thought process, and you're conscious about it at all times. And so I think that's really important. And if you think about my gender in this particular scenario, I have been thinking about it for days. I genuinely believe that if I was a man, people wouldn't have attacked me. There may be a male making an absurd statement online, people will come to me to verify it. If I give them a measured answer and say, I don't actually know if that's true or not because I don't have evidence, I'm the one who gets attacked, not the person who's made the false statement. And that's because he's a man. And I definitely think the way we treat men and women in general it's not definitely not equal. And therefore we should remember that there are other issues, maybe more important issues, which we should be addressing in a more gendered lens. Thank you.
Thank you, Asha. Thank you for being a very candid and thought-provoking opinion. We'll discuss. I think you highlighted the need for women to work hard and then prove themselves so that people will look at you as a role model. So that these kind of the small things that we can adapt because we need this transformational change in Sri Lanka. The way we looked at it, I think you highlighted in this term the intersectional feminism. So that's lot plugged into the one word. So probably we can articulate and unpack it a little bit more. So let's move to our next speaker before the discussion. So it's my pleasure to introduce Ms. Vishaka Tilakaratne, consultant food security and community development activist. For nearly 10 years, Vishaka had held the post of National Program Officer, Mother and Child Nutrition at World Food Program in Sri Lanka, and the National Professional Officer, Nutrition and Food Safety at World Health Organization Sri Lanka office. She's a nutritionist, food technologist with a master's degree in food technology in developing countries from King's College, University of London. Vishaka is an activist working on issues of injustice, particularly with regard to the rights of women, children, and animals. She was the Chief Commissioner of the Sri Lanka Girl Guides Association and past president of the Nutritional Society of Sri Lanka. So it's a great pleasure to have Vishaka today. Vishaka, floor is yours.
Thank you, Ananda. Very nice to be back with friends, and very, very nice to listen to Asha. It's so educational, and it's the first time I think that I have listened to you at length, and it gives a really good backdrop to discuss the order of the day. And I must say, some very good questions or areas of discussion have been sent. But at the outset, let me say, contrary to all the kudos that we get when our resumes are read and so on, I feel very humbled, because if we don't actually change the bottom line of those fragile communities, especially women, then, I just merely can call myself a development worker. That's the kind of introspection that I always, sitting in the bathroom perhaps, think about and ponder, are we really making an impact? So I think these conversations are very, very important. And the first area to discuss is, of course, the gendered impact of climate change. So Asha, thank you again for elaborating. And let me just, take you perhaps through a kind of a structured conversation. I hope it won't be too boring, but it might be easier to have some metrics into this. And when we look at gender roles for men and women, of course, this is part of the conversation. We have to have our communication with the other half. And this comes under, I think, three, segments. One is the reproductive role, the productive role, and the social role, so gender roles. And then splicing against these roles, we have a couple of phenomena that I would like to kind of, give examples. And that's the reduction of biodiversity in climate change, and our hydrology table or water access, and food security is the third pillar. Of course, all are interconnected. And very, very simply, before we actually start on this, this kind of framework, let me just espouse a little bit about Sri Lanka, because the climate change, experience really directly impinges on the agricultural and the rural community. And when we say agricultural, of course, it includes fisheries as well as livestock and, rural industry. Now, of course, in the planet, we are all affected. That goes without saying. But I think vulnerability-wise, we need to really look at these communities. So if we look at the base capacity, because we also need to talk about empowerment and how ready or how vulnerable our communities. In Sri Lanka, in the agricultural community, as you know, there is a large proportion of women working. Of course, on the unskilled side. And if you look at different parameters, women have very little access to technology. Now, I was, looking at the Farm Mechanization Training Center in Anuradhapura and how many females were actually, attending. Now, technology has a lot to do, as you know, not only with agriculture, but also with climate mitigation and resilience. And we found that only 10% of females had attended these capacity building sessions for the past 3 to 5 years. And in that also, when females attended, they have been asked to take the place of males who were too busy to attend. So, that's one great area, because whether it's conservation of soil or, water bodies, technology is essential. Prevention of erosion. Then if you look at access to land, now of all owned land, women barely own 16% of that land area. Now, the agricultural structures are that you need to own land to be registered for various trainings and access to subsidies and inputs and so on. So when you do the calculation, barely 5% of women have access to major irrigation. And therefore they fall into what you call, micro or small scale agriculture. And men actually dominate major agriculture or, paddy lands and so on. So that in itself, again, as we splice, we have 2 lots. Then access to credit. Now, credit and, finances have a lot to do with building resilience and your own capacities. And also the other pillar would be under that social protection. Now, when you look at pension schemes for farmers, barely 10% of females are members of those pension schemes. So I'm just setting this out before you to show the fragility, the degree of fragility and vulnerability when, climate change falls on those. So to give some very, very simple examples, in the productive role, if women are always relegated to subsistence agriculture and the home garden, due to climate change, the impact of climate change, we know that home gardens today do not actually sustain. So today, even NGOs, INGOs, or even the UN invest a lot in home gardening, but down the line, on the second, second 3 months, you have to go and look for the home garden. So the females are not in macro agriculture, even in minor agriculture, there are so many challenges. Now, all this is to do with the productive or the livelihood, role of women. Then extension, agricultural extension and disaster mitigation today. It's almost, coming together, and it should be delivered together. However, even extension, there is a bias, gender bias, and most often extension workers would prefer to talk to women and transfer these technologies, talk to men and transfer these technologies to men. So there in itself, there is an issue. But when you talk with those extension workers, they would actually like to have the training or delivery of capacity or exchange both ways, but this has not been mainstream. So, against this backdrop, you see many hindrances where women fall into that pile of the poorest, the most vulnerable, and vulnerabilities of many, shapes and sizes. Now, a very important aspect, if you go into water access, women have more demands, as you know, for water, playing both their reproductive and productive role. That is for your livelihoods, whether it's a home garden or whether it's agro, development or small scale agro processing, water is of utmost importance. And 1/6 of the world's population, we know, has reduced water access at the moment, and of course it's increasing day by day. So, the impact is there. Then women also have their personal needs for water. for reproductive health needs. And again, water resources, if you take a village, that too is controlled to an extent by, the power play. So the more powerful businessman or the large farmer would, come and wash their vehicle when women are waiting, in a queue to access water. So the impact of, climate change really falls on all these variables, and it is not a comfortable situation. If we take the incidence of these 213 incidents of disaster around the world on average each year, we can just imagine the magnitude, the number of communities that it has impacted. So in Sri Lanka, we, when we talk about empowerment, a lot of the empowerment is either transferred by state service providers or by women being in various groups, like, community-based organizations. It may be women-related, it would be savings and credit, like Samurdhi or Sanasa, or it could be a simple funeral society. Now, because of the lack of access or lack of land ownership, if you take mixed farm organizations, where women actually could, learn about leadership and empowerment, this is also denied to them because of archaic constitutions of these farm organizations. Very often, I have actually, examined this situation and studied some of the farm organizations. It was news to me that the constitution very often does not permit women even to talk, and they go there to represent their husbands, who are the official landowners. And of course, land ownership and title holding, the legalities, prevent women also even from accessing land today, and that is now being changed. Customary laws are being changed, but women become voiceless, let alone gathering leadership. So, that is one of the issues of patriarchy within the community-based organizations, farmer, fisheries. Now, if you consider fisheries societies, it's highly male-dominated, and even if women take part of that, activity of making dry fish by the leftover fish, they need lands to dry the dry fish. And very often, even for this, permission has to be obtained from the male-driven fisheries society. So if you take also rural industries like Palmyra, according to caste norms, women will never hold office. So again, when you have marginalization through climate change, women who lack social protection, who lack the resources, who lack a voice, and their voices are muted, rights are limited, then it is a cocktail for a very sad situation. So I think we need to be positive and see what recommendations can be made, and these have been discussed through several reports. If you go on the net, there are many reports, and I myself have been part of the contingent assessment for FAO in 2018 of the agriculture and the rural sector, and where we have made recommendations from the national level right down to the grassroots. Now, at national level, in order to address both climate change and agriculture and agricultural productivity, one needs a focal point to take this on. If not, the issues get watered down. So, when I was actually doing my research, it was very difficult to find who the focal point for gender was in the Ministry of Agriculture. So I asked them, by citing several meetings, who represented you? And they said, I think on Thursday it was X, and a month before it was Y, and another month before it was Z. So then one wonders, how do you take forward mainstreaming gender in policy making, actioning, and research? Now, when one turns to actually rural and agricultural research, it's very heartening that there are actually more females in agricultural research. That's a kind of a outlier or a confound. However, if we don't have gender responsive budgeting to actually transfer this research equally or equitably, not equally, equitably, according to the needs of both genders, then where does one stand? It is the same with other research, agro-processing, industrial research. It's gathering dust inside laboratories, but there are people out there who are crying, to apply this research. Now, if I take an example, contrary to this, in India, with the Swaminathan Institute. Swaminathan is one of the most famous, promoters of food production and food security. The Swaminathan Institute has modified technology for the use of women and actually illiterate women. Now in Sri Lanka, we are very fortunate with our education system that our females also are even more literate than the men when you look at percentages. But the Swaminathan Institute has actually transformed agricultural technology with gender sensitivity for the use of women. Even fisher women have a 3-button computer near the ocean where they can press a button to check, the climate of the day. And Indian women, actually, there are a lot of fisher women who go out to sea so that they can use. In India also, there is a department of modifying technology for the use of women, lighter technology, etc. And that's an entire department. And again, the budget is engendered to kind of support that activity. So, there are means and ways. And of course, we really need to look below the national, allocation of females into positions, let alone the focal points. How many women are there in the planning service, in leadership roles? Now, the Sri Lanka Planning Service has 28% females. Then the administrative service at the top, actually we were a bit better a while ago, but today we have also gone to a very low percentage. In Parliament, when we talk about, allocation of resources, we have even lost the 5% that we had in Parliament, in the current situation. So that is at the top level. At the medium level, when you take agro technology centers or the agrarian service centers, we see a lesser percentage of females who are heading, and even those females have not been gender sensitized to bring rural women into that main, what we call macro, agriculture or viable agriculture. So even these women officers think that women can be relegated to, the home garden. And as we said, the home garden is extremely fragile, especially with climate change. So, there are those issues. Then extension services and disaster mitigation services. I was just counting up the percentage of officers. There are about 20% females. Now, one can argue that whether it's a male or a female, services should be delivered regardless. But unfortunately, in countries like Sri Lanka, though our gender development or basics of development like health and education for women, it's quite high, the gender empowerment measure, as you know, is very low. So it's okay if we have, males doing this job, but there has to be some sort of resource allocation to sensitize these extension workers on having an equal, interplay between the genders. So, that is at the kind of the medium level. And even in disaster mitigation, we know a lot of the time men talk to men. So, it's very hard for women to get a conversation, in there. Then if you take the community level, as I explained earlier, where actually both men and women can get, training, know-how, access to market information, that is also patriarchal and male dominated. So there has not been a kind of a conversation and a sensitization to address that at the bottom level. Now, we've actually developing a manual for about 500 agrarian services officers, and we trained them on that manual about 3 years ago under the purview of the Ministry of Women Development and Agrarian Services Department. And there, you begin the conversation and you see how little sensitization has been there. And with a 3-day training, it's almost impossible. And I'm sorry to say, all our international agencies, as well as local agencies, think that the gender dialogue can be done in 3 days inside an air-conditioned room. We have actually, been a little creative and tried to put together an immersion program for, gender sensitization and gender transformation. And I'm sorry to say that, these kinds of, trainings or out-of-the-box thinking is actually not accepted. And usually, it's a kind of a 4-day training. Yes, finish it quickly, come out with a plan. After that, do you follow up on the plan? Do you see whether your administrators and your agriculture officers or your fisheries officers go and actually act on that? So all this comes into this argument. So mine really is, a little bit where the majority argument is on the, rural agriculture fragility, because climate change has a lot to do with it. And Asha, you have dealt a lot with that aspect. So I really don't want to repeat. Now, as far as COVID is concerned, we know that with COVID too, the burdens and the harassment, the lack of security of females, I mean, that has really come out. We saw domestic violence increasing in the household. We saw the provider of food, mainly in the household, grappling with the access, and low food security. Yeah, you see, you have to keep childcare and children, activated because schools are not there. Then that is again a cocktail of, lack of access to data and, equipment for children to actually make maximum use of the education system. So those were the spill-offs of COVID. But if I may just talk about climate change and COVID, some of the observations which show obviously the connection. I mean, you cited, deforestation, but we also know that pollution and indoor pollution has a lot to do with it. So the causal analysis, becomes the same. And without taking a back seat, I think both these many integrated, areas have to be taken together. And I don't really know about the climate, dialogue. There is even no dialogue on the causes of COVID. So, that is very sad, because we try to actually have some magic bullets like vaccines and, masks and, sanitizers to address the COVID issue. But when you get to the root cause of, addressing, we will have to go into a totally different business model in order to address, because this model of resource intensive, high carbon footprint, kind of model cannot go on. And I think, and I'm sorry to be kind of speculationist, but people don't want to actually address the root cause because it opens a can of worms. And that can of worms falls more on females rather than males, unfortunately. So let me stop there. Thank you very much for this opportunity.
Thank you, Shaka. I think you highlighted many entry points where you could use very strategically. I think Asha wants to add a few things before we get into the discussion. Asha?
Yeah, that is excellent, Visakha. Really great to hear you with all your passion and all your knowledge. And I just want to respond to some of the things you said and possibly even add to some of it. For example, you opened with saying, if we're not thinking about our most marginalized communities, then, what are we doing? And it's true. I was listening to a podcast where they were saying, if we're not addressing the issues of the most, if we address the issues of the most marginalized communities, then everybody's lifestyle, there's an improvement for everybody, right? So if we can make that our benchmark, we're improving life at the bottom, which is where we should be focusing our energy. And I absolutely agree with you. Just a few quick points. As you say, part of, like with fisheries, a lot of the time women are so undervalued in fisheries, right? A lot of the time they don't even know they're part of the fisheries industry. And that is something we encountered because with the first lot of lockdowns with COVID, we did a survey straight after that to look at how these communities coped with that lockdown, because they weren't allowed to go into fishing and stuff. And we allocated 25% of our surveys. So we did 415 surveys in a month across the island. And we allocated 25% to actually trying to speak to women. And it was so hard for multiple reasons, including women themselves don't even recognize that they're part of that sector because they're so undervalued in that sector. And so where do we begin with that, right? Who are we representing then? And then how do we have these conversations? And the data that we get, it's generally gender disaggregated for fisheries especially. And as you say, the fisheries organizations are very male dominated. So these women also get stamped out. And I was reading somewhere where, like if you calculate the number of hours women are doing in the background, like mending nets and stuff, it's a huge percentage. And it's not documented as a contribution to our fisheries-based economy. And I think that, to me, that's so telling about how we think about this problem. And then, even through our surveys, it seems obvious, but, one of the things with the coping mechanism was the pawning of jewelry. And again, we see that the women are coming to this position where they're giving up and having to rescue this situation, like you say, when we're seeing the breadwinner, having a difficult time flailing at that moment. And you have the women stepping up and they're, again, providing support. But is that being considered as part of the larger conversation of how women and the women's role in that situation in terms of contributing to the adaptability and the survivability of that family, right? I don't know how we're thinking about that. And then just the last point, and I don't want to take everyone's time, so because you've got so many fantastic things that people want to ask questions on, but also if we think about the root cause, absolutely 100%, right? So when we think about COVID, we think about everything is health-based, right? We talk about health-based grants, we think about health-based solutions, but as you say, nobody wants to address the real situation, which is, as I was saying, especially with climate change, we are going to come face to face with more and more of these pathogen hosts, these new species. And that's why we have to, if we're in this recovery phase, we need to start thinking very differently about how we addressing the problems through climate action, right? So we need to stop all these actions that are driving climate change, because they will help us in terms of our health and reducing risk and stuff like that to communities as well. So absolutely 100% totally agree with you. And I wish more of our conversations and the funding was also balanced. It was like, let's look at how do we manage these situations from an environmental green standpoint, but also from the health standpoint. How do we have these conversations with people, right? Environment is always kind of shoved in the corner in all situations. But thank you for your comments very much.
Thank you, Asha.
Thanks, Asha. It's very clear now. Actually, you need to connect the environmental health and human health and wildlife health and all these economics. Now, increasingly, now the private sector is taking the lead, because now they know they will not survive unless you connect it. So, and the EU, the whole green challenge is all about greening the whole value chain so that people will have high income and are more sensitive to the ecosystem, so that the COVID type of interactions, bringing the wildlife to the domestic front, will become less and less. So with that, I think there are a bunch of questions emerging, but I can probably frame it in a slightly different way that we can answer. I think both of your presentations involved the need to find a good wavelength to communicate not only to the women. Now, we always talked about women empowerment, and we go and have lectures and lectures. But now we see the problem. The other side don't understand the value of the role. I think, pawning your jewelry, eating less, getting hammered with the nutrition side, and then evacuating into a center and not having the right facilities, things like pads and things like that. So you can see all this men-driven planning has to be addressed by telling it in the right wavelength, because there's a male thing, there's an ego thing. So then how do we, knowing it, how do we balance it? What kind of data? As Sri Lanka, we need to generate the minimum data set. Now, I think Vishaka spoke about the agriculture, but I think what are the ways of generating that minimum data set? Because I think one of the questions is to Vishaka is how can you bring this urgent feminine revolution? But revolution is not revolution, but the transformation. So for that, how do we position us better so that the political authority, the administrative structure, and our own household male, including kids, will understand these different aspects? What do you think? It's a general question for you both.
Yes. Asha, do you want to go first, or can I?
Yeah, go ahead, Vishaka.
Okay. Right. I think, Ananda, to be very fair, there have been attempts, and I think we are having some of these conversations and attempts, based on evidence. We have gathered evidence, and also the recommendations. One of the key recommendations, and I think it was mentioned by Asha, it's about gender disaggregated information. About 5 years ago, a local NGO actually had to do some data gathering on which part of the rural landscape women were earning livelihoods. Now, that's very, very important to know if you're going to do something. Now, another great attempt has been by one of the ministers of agriculture to set up women farm organizations. Not that there weren't women farm organizations, but fairly, practical organizations that also addressed the cultural dynamic of, mixing ethnicities and having absolute Sri Lankanness. And these little organizations are called Sitamo, Sinhala, Tamil, and Muslim. Excellent, concept, but with one problem. Because women could not comfortably traverse, the arena of the male-driven farm organizations, these female farm organizations were set up. Now, that has pros and cons. Of course, women could be addressed directly, but that's a gender-direct kind of intervention. Now, when women and men are put together, how do they have a conversation? Now, when they are totally, removed. But it's a very good inroad into gathering data as well as having this conversation. Then I would say that there are, many forums and, discussions with top level, officials in the ministries. And of course, there have been many, many gender sensitization or training programs. But I think all is not lost. Sri Lanka is very open to also the progression, and we are very proud also about certain aspects of progress in this arena. So we must make use of that to have this evidence-based, not only discussions, but mainstreaming policy. Now, the agriculture policy for many years lumped women, youth, and the disabled together. But I think now it has, gradually, been corrected, and there is some attention paid. So I think, these are the kinds of things that need to be kind of structured, and also to get on to actual resource allocation. And like India, maybe have not just the women farmer subject matter officers within the Ministry of Agriculture in all the districts to show them how to make short eats, healthy short eats and food, but to actually traverse this whole arena of empowerment. And like in Ethiopia now is so progressive that it has got an agricultural transformation agency, where all the young graduates from the top universities, they come back into the government actually to transform agriculture. Then we need to do in a very constructive, structured manner, land zoning, and use geographical information systems, to splice our data. So with this, I think Ananda and I think the UNDP, FAO, all the UN agencies plus the INGOs, mean well, and a lot is done. But you need to scale up. You need to scale up. Now, UNDP, I was involved with the country program evaluation, 2012 to 2017. There have been some excellent attempts to get women into the planning conversation, where women have been consulted by the government agents or the district secretaries. And they have actually, out of 30 themes for the 5-year district plan, for example, in Mondragala, 17 themes were taken from the female groups. So I think these are excellent things that we need to not reinvent the wheel, but look at what's useful, sift it out, and scale up.
Thank you, Asha.
I don't have a lot to add to that, but just a couple of things. I totally agree. I agree with everything Isaka says. I think one other issue I would say, certainly in spaces like science, where we're addressing climate change specifically, if you have a meeting about women empowerment or women's role in science or something, anywhere in the world, you'll find that it's all women who come to the room, even if it's an invitation to everyone. And it just goes to show how in our mindset, a woman's problem is considered a woman's problem, right? And women are to address it on their own. And it's very rare that you get men in the room in those situations. And I think that's something in the scientific community needs to change if we want to be able to think at like climate change research and stuff, in thinking about how do we make sure that we're gender disaggregating what we're doing. And so, yeah, to me, that's sort of like one of the key things. And the second thing I would say is, I'll go back to the education thing, right? Like we are culturally in schools, we are asked, especially, girls, where we are asked to behave a certain way. You can't speak out, you can't ask questions, you have to do this. That impacts you through life, right? So if we think about that, like what are we teaching our kids in school? Should we not teaching them the ability to think? We all know that, but also how to, sit and have a conversation, have a discussion, so that we can start to have these men and women in one room. So there's no intimidation between the genders, because I think that doesn't help for us to start to bridge these gaps as well. And I think, to me, as a person who thinks about education a lot, I think there's a systemic problem in our education system. And if we can start to really think about that and address that from there, we can actually start to empower people to, to be not a female farmer, but a farmer, right? And that's where we need to go. And it's not, we shouldn't have a gender attached to every title. We should accept that everyone, while we all have different needs as our different genders, we're still all playing the same role, so to speak.
Thank you, Asha. There was a question about one of your observations, like women need to be harder to prove themselves. I think probably it was misinterpreted what you said. Probably can you shed a little bit more light into that? Why you
No,
said
I mean, I don't, it's not a misinterpretation. I will tell you 100%. Unfortunately, certainly in my field, I have had to work really hard to be acknowledged, because everybody's assumption is that my job is a man's job, right? First, like I said, when I started out, people were like, ha, 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 what are you going to do as a marine biologist? Because nobody had heard about a marine biologist. And then when I became a marine biologist, they were like, oh, well done, Puta. But when are you going to get a real job and settle down? And isn't that a man's job, right? Like that's right here. And I'm like, it's a real job. And to me, like I tell people, you don't have to have a specific gender to care for something. And fundamentally, my job is about caring for the oceans, right? So we need to start rethinking how we say these things. So yes, 100% not fair, right? My job as someone who has broken into this field is to try to change those norms. So anyone who comes after me doesn't have to go through those same biases, because they're really holding us back from being progressive and making change. My point being that you work hard enough that people stop seeing you for your gender and your background, right? So that people are not like, she's a woman, no, so I don't know if we should ask her. Whereas they're like, oh, she's a marine biologist. We need a marine biologist in the room right now. We need to call her, right? Like that's sort of what I want the narrative to change into, so that we're not being seen for, she's a girl, or oh, she can only do this, oh, she must be having family commitments, therefore we can't ask her to come, right? Like a lot of people will make those excuses on your behalf if that's their portrayal of you. But if you remind people that, well, I'm a marine biologist and I'm here to do this job, I think it changes the narrative. And I think that's where we want to get, where you work hard enough that people are not judging you based on your gender or your background or where you went to school. None of that should matter. In the end, it's like, what are you capable of doing?
Exactly. Thanks. Thanks, Asha, because I think that's my experience as well. We train a lot of our female co-workers to be very bold and unbiased and represent and stand. I think it works actually. So I think we should encourage all university and all this youth to stand on their own and then just say whatever comes to your head first, and then of course defense with facts. So having said that, I think there were another question about, I think it's a global question. Can you piggyback on the sustainability movement to make our lives better now? For example, I see the European countries are advocating involving women in within family communication and leading to balancing nutrition, health, then kids education, and also to the extent that you bring things like the zero discharge to environment, because now those are the new themes coming up. That means the whole different set of educational tools are required to back up this transformational change. Where are we? I mean, how much material, what is the mechanism we need to put together? I think, Asha, you mentioned about the supplementary material and to back up the educational system on the coastal marine. Likewise, now there should be a set of interventions that the UN and others can take forward, building up the toolkits so that the new post-COVID nature-based evolution can be supported. What are your comments?
Asha, I think you should go forward on that.
Okay, so can I ask for a little more clarity on that question, please?
Basically, now the world is expecting us to connect with the nature, and also the women to now Vishaka said that the home gardens failed.
Yeah.
But the home gardens I know and were successful when we connected the nutrition and the kids' involvement and the record keeping, like how much you produce, how much you sold, and how much you consumed. So that kind of a total packages. Now, in this new context of post-COVID green development, in Sri Lanka, what are the things that the UN, UN Women, UNDP, FAO, and other NGOs and any other institutions can do to help the nation? What are the two type of toolkits?
Okay, so that's something that I haven't really had time to think about. But one of my things would be that there should be discussion of the needs and opportunities that exist on the ground rather than blanket opportunities. So sometimes what happens is with larger agencies, they will have a set of blanket sort of suggestions that they will take from place to place. And that doesn't always work, right? So like Visakha says, a lot of agencies can come and do home gardening, right? But if it's not something that's going to be successful, right, what are the needs of that community? And I think that stakeholder consultation is quite an important role, plays a really important role in defining what those goals, what those steps, what are those interventions should be if we actually want to see success.
Thanks.
Yes.
So, Vishaka?
Yes, I think, the participatory role, yes, cannot be, ignored. We need to engage. But as I said, this classification, what I spoke about earlier, now in a particular area, one size does not fit all. So that particular classification, photographic, tracking, engaging in that particular context, all that becomes important in the toolkit. So the toolkit can go as far as, guiding, on these conversations. And also, I think it is time that we actually, using GIS and other methodology, actually inventorized what we are all doing in livelihood development. What is the length and breadth of livelihood development activities? And how does climate change impinge on that experience? I think it's time to have a big consultation, not a but maybe field-based consultation, years of livelihood, and then you can do this one-stop shop, but not to have one size fits all, but to look at that particular context. So actually the Govijana Kendra and the environmental arm of a district should be working together on that particular, experience and taking it forward strategically.
Thank you, Vishaka. I think we are literally running out of the time allotted for us. We are past 6 o'clock. I need to apologize because I tried to combine few questions to save time because we had to wind at 6 o'clock. I see a comment that I have misrepresented some of the questions. Probably I request you and women to pick up these questions and work with us. Probably we'll be very happy to provide direct questions. So my apologies if somebody felt like I misinterpreted, but genuine reason I did that to get 3-4 questions together. But I think all in all, it was a good discussion. There are a lot of points for us to take forward. So let me thank first organizers, the UN Women and the French Embassy. And there are a lot of people who are behind the scene. Esther being one, and so they are the engine. So thank you very much to everybody. And finally, Natasha DeVos and Vishaka Tilakaratne for attending today and also keeping this presentations very lively. That I think no wonder with your long experience in these different subjects and exposure made this interesting. So thank you so much and good night everyone and good morning to anybody around the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.
Sure. Thanks everyone.